The sun rose over a world that believed in peace. Golden light spilled across kingdoms, fields, and oceans that had known silence for too long. Children chased each other through cobblestone streets, merchants opened their shops, and church bells echoed from the hills. It was a morning like any other, too ordinary to realize it was the last of its kind. Atheron's capital shimmered under that morning glow. Inside the royal palace, marble corridors reflected the light, like veins of gold. The great hall smelled of incense and polished steel as King Alaric IV stood before his generals. His voice was calm, but behind his words ran the tremor of something darker. "They think we have grown soft," he said. "Let them think so. A lion resting in the grass is still a lion." The generals nodded, uneasy. Rumors had already reached them, border skirmishes, secret alliances, ships vanishing at sea, yet no one dared call it what it was. Across the Western Ocean, the Republic of Ardania thrummed with noise. In the parliament, President Lucien Drax leaned forward on the podium, his hands gripping the edge as if he could shake the world itself. "They drain our blood for their empire," he thundered. "They steal our gold and call it trade. They enslave our sons and call it duty. But we will call it what it is: tyranny." The crowd roared back with one word: freedom. Newspapers printed his speech before the ink was even dry. The streets erupted in celebration. In those shouts of triumph, no one heard the whisper of coming war. Merchants on both sides wrote nervous letters. "Something feels wrong," one trader penned to his brother. "The soldiers march more often now. They say it's training, but their faces tell another story." The letter never arrived. Somewhere in the mountains, the mail train exploded. An accident, they said, though everyone knew it was sabotage. Weeks passed. The air thickened with fear. Across taverns and marketplaces, the same rumor grew: a secret pact, a stolen weapon, a coming reckoning. Still life went on. Lovers met under lamplight. Children played with wooden swords, pretending to be heroes they might soon become. Then, one bright afternoon in the neutral kingdom of Argon, the world tilted. Crowds lined the streets for the royal parade, music ringing from brass bands. A young man stood among them, his coat buttoned to the neck, his eyes fixed on the golden carriage rolling toward him. His hand trembled inside his pocket. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath, then a flash, a thunderclap, and the scream of shattering glass. Smoke, blood, chaos. When the air cleared, the heir to Atheron's throne lay lifeless on the cobblestones. Within hours, the story leapt across borders faster than wind. By nightfall, every newspaper carried the same headline: "Prince assassinated. Empire blames Republic." Crowds filled the squares. Some shouted for justice, others for revenge. Armies that had slept for years awoke with a single command: mobilize. In the palace, King Alaric stared at the portrait of his dead son. "They think this will frighten me," he said softly. "It will only feed the fire," his advisor whispered. "Your Majesty, vengeance will burn more than it heals." The king's eyes were cold, then let it burn. Across the sea, President Drax lit a cigar and stared at the horizon. "They want war," he murmured to his generals. "Let them come. We'll show them what the Republic is made of." The room erupted in applause, but outside the window, the sky turned gray. In a quiet village far from both capitals, 19-year-old Elias Corin packed his small bag. The draft letter lay on the table beside his mother's hands. She tried to smile, but failed. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered. He nodded, forcing a grin. "It'll be over soon, Ma. They say by Christmas." He hugged her, feeling her tears on his neck, then boarded the train with hundreds of other boys whose laughter hid their fear. Steam hissed, whistles blew, and as the train pulled away, every mother in that crowd felt the same hollow ache. Factories blazed through the night, belching smoke and sparks. Guns rolled out by the thousands, uniforms by the millions. The sky above industrial cities glowed red as if dawn had come early, but it was firelight. The world was preparing for something it did not yet believe in. In taverns, soldiers raised glasses, toasting to glory. In churches, priests prayed for peace that would not come. In the corridors of power, pens scratched signatures that sealed fates of generations unborn. And all the while, the wind carried the scent of rain and gunpowder. Elias and his unit reached the frontier at sunset, The land stretched before them, quiet and endless. Somewhere beyond the hills, the enemy waited unseen. The boy stared at the horizon and thought of home, the color of his mother's shawl, the sound of his father's laughter. A voice beside him broke the silence. "Scared?" the sergeant asked. Elias swallowed. "Sir." But his hands trembled around his rifle. Night fell. Campfires flickered like stars on the ground. Letters were written by trembling hands and tucked into jackets. The smell of oil and iron filled the air. A distant rumble echoed, thunder, perhaps, or something else. No one slept much. Back in the capital, the king stood on his balcony, watching the same storm clouds crawl across the sky. "So it begins," he whispered. Lightning flashed, and for a second, the whole city shone like a forge. The next morning, the world woke to the roar of artillery. Borders dissolved in fire. Men who had never met pointed rifles at each other's hearts. The first shells fell on a quiet valley, flattening forests, turning earth to smoke. Birds rose in flocks and vanished into the gray. Somewhere amid the chaos, Elias ducked behind a trench wall as dirt exploded around him. The ground shook, his ears rang. He could taste metal in the air. Round him men shouted, cursed, prayed. He lifted his head and saw the sky black with smoke, red with dawn. The world he had known was gone. And yet, for a heartbeat, there was silence. The kind that comes before the second strike, before the true storm. The narrator's voice broke through that silence. History turns not with thunder, but with whispers. The world slept under a golden sky, not knowing it would wake to fire. The camera of memory pans outward over mountains, over oceans, over cities about to crumble. One by one, lights go out. The age of peace ends, and the age of ashes begins. The first shots of war echoed like thunder across the valleys of the old world. Smoke rose from cities that had not seen battle in generations. Bells rang not for worship, but for warning. The war that leaders had promised would be swift and glorious began with confusion, blood, and disbelief. Elias Corin crouched inside a trench carved hastily into the earth. Mud clung to his uniform. Rain fell in thin, cold lines, turning the ground to a swamp of filth and fear. Around him, soldiers whispered prayers or clutched letters from home. No one spoke loudly. No one dared. Then, far in the distance, came the low mechanical growl, the sound of artillery wheels grinding through mud. The sergeant's voice cut through the murmur. "Positions. Keep your heads down." Moments later, the sky itself opened. Shells screamed through the air, bursting like demons across the horizon. Earth, metal, and flesh scattered into one. The world became noise. Elias pressed himself against the trench wall as a blast tore through the line. He felt the shock ripple through his chest, the taste of dirt and smoke filling his mouth. Someone was screaming his name, but the voice was lost in the roar. When the barrage stopped, he lifted his head. The fields beyond were no longer green, were a graveyard of twisted steel and broken men. The captain stumbled past, blood on his face, shouting orders that no one could hear. "Hold the line. Reinforcements are coming." But the reinforcements never came. It's only more shells, more fire, more fear. By nightfall, the trench smelled of sweat, gunpowder, and death. At dawn, a whistle pierced the fog. "Forward." The sergeant shouted. Elias climbed out of the trench with shaking hands, his rifle heavy, his legs numb. They ran through smoke and mud over bodies that hours ago had been laughing boys like him. Bullets hissed past like angry wasps. He fired without aiming, just shapes in the mist. Someone fell beside him. He didn't look. He couldn't. When the order finally came to retreat, half the unit didn't move. Some lay silent. Some whispered for their mothers. Elias stumbled back into the trench, fell to his knees, and realized he was crying. "I thought it would be different," he murmured. The sergeant, a man with hollow eyes, handed him a flask. "Always is, boy. The first battle burns everything you were before." Far behind the front lines, the capital celebrated victory. Newspapers declared enemy forces repelled. Politicians toasted to courage and glory. Posters showed smiling soldiers and waving flags. The truth, the screams, the terror, the smell of burned flesh never reached the printing presses. The war had become a story, and the world preferred the lie. In Atheron, King Alaric stood on his balcony, the city glittering below. "We will crush them by winter," he told his advisors. "Our armies are invincible," but the reports he ignored told another tale. Tens of thousands lost in the first week alone. Entire battalions gone without trace. He stared at the horizon where thunderclouds gathered and whispered to himself, "For my son. This is justice." Yet somewhere inside, even he felt the tremor of guilt. Across the sea, President Drax visited the factories where weapons were made. Workers cheered as he passed, their faces smeared with oil and exhaustion. "Every bullet brings us closer to freedom," he declared. The crowd roared. But outside, the smoke from the factories rose so thick it turned day to dusk. Freedom was becoming hard to breathe. In the middle of all this, the soldiers fought on. Weeks bled into months. The front lines moved inches at a time, at the cost of thousands of lives. Trenches filled with water, rats, and disease. Food rotted before it reached the men. Letters from home arrived, stained with mud, or not at all. Still, the orders came: advance, hold, advance again. Elias learned to stop counting days. He learned to sleep sitting up, to eat without tasting, to ignore the smell of death. He learned that courage was indeed about not being afraid. It was about walking through fear anyway. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the ruins of a village, Elias sat with his friend Tomas, another young soldier with a smile that still remembered laughter. Tomas lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "You think anyone will remember us after this?" he asked quietly. Elias looked at the horizon, the sky bleeding into night. "If they win, maybe. If we lose, maybe more." They laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing left to do. That night the enemy attacked again. Flares streaked across the sky, lighting the battlefield like false daylight. Gunfire roared. Men shouted, stumbled, fell. Elias fired until his rifle jammed, then grabbed another from the ground. He didn't think, he didn't feel, he just survived. When dawn broke, the world was silent again. Smoke drifted like ghosts above the fields. Elias walked among the fallen, searching for Tomas. He found him half buried under mud. Eyes open, a faint smile still on his lips. Elias knelt, closing them gently. "You were right," he whispered. "Someone will remember." Behind every soldier, somewhere, a family waited. Mothers kept empty chairs at tables. Wives read and reread the same letters until the paper tore. Children played war in the streets, too young to know their fathers were dying in one. The war had reached every home, every heart. Winter came early. The world turned white, but the snow could not hide the blood. Armies froze in place, locked in an endless struggle neither side could win. Commanders spoke of strategy. Soldiers spoke of survival. And above it all, the leaders continued to promise victory. In one of his speeches, President Drax declared, "This war will end when tyranny falls." Across the sea, King Alaric shouted to his council, "This war will end when the Republic kneels." Each believed himself the hero of history, which had forgotten the cost. Elias wrote a letter that night, his hands stiff from cold. "Dear Ma," he began. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me. It's hard to describe this place. The sky is always gray, and the ground never stops shaking. But I still dream of home. I dream of the orchard, of the river, of you." He paused, staring at the words. Then he added, "Tell little Anna I'll teach her to fish when I return." He didn't know if the letter would ever leave the trench. By the time spring returned, the war had devoured half the continent. Cities burned, fields turned to mud, and the rivers ran red. New weapons appeared, machines that roared louder than thunder, gases that crawled invisible through the wind. Soldiers no longer saw faces, only masks. The air itself had become an enemy. One evening, as the sky turned the color of rust, Elias watched from a hill as two armies clashed in the distance. Explosions blossomed like flowers of fire. "It's beautiful," someone muttered beside him. Elias shook his head, his hell pretending to be beautiful. That night, the narrator's voice rose above the silence. "The first flames of war are always bright. They light the sky, they blind the eyes, they burn away the truth. And when the smoke clears, all that remains is the question, what have we done?" As the world below burned, leaders toasted in marble halls, soldiers prayed in trenches, and the stars above watched cold and silent as mankind's greatest war began its endless march. The third year of the war began with silence, a silence more terrifying than gunfire. The trenches had gone quiet, the fields between them littered with the remains of everything that had once been called civilization. Villages no longer had names, only coordinates. Rivers ran black with oil and ash. Wind carried the smell of things that should never have burned. Elias Corrin no longer counted days or seasons. It had become part of the earth itself. Mud on his boots, dust in his lungs, blood on his hands. His eyes, once bright and curious, had turned the color of the smoke that never left the horizon. The boy who had left his mother's home was gone. What remained was something harder, quieter, unbreakable, but no longer whole. Orders came in the dead of night. A new offensive, the largest yet. The Empire would strike at dawn. They said it would end the war. Every army said the same before every battle, but this time the officers looked different, not hopeful, but desperate. Elias cleaned his rifle in silence. Around him, men smoked, prayed, wrote last letters. One carved his name into the wooden wall of the trench. "So the earth remembers," he said. No one laughed. At dawn, the fog hung thick as cloth. When the first whistle blew, it sounded less like a command and more like a death sentence. The men climbed from the trench into the gray world above. The ground shook beneath their boots. Artillery thundered in the distance, then closer, then all at once. The horizon lit up like the end of the world. Elias ran. The air screamed. Men fell beside him, some shouting, some silent. He kept running. The mud sucked at his feet, the sky flashed red and white. Somewhere ahead he saw the enemy lines, black shapes in the mist, firing, reloading, firing again. He aimed, fired, reloaded, moved. Hours passed in seconds. By the time the sun broke through, the field was gone, only craters, smoke, and the moaning of the wounded. When night came, Elias found himself alone among the dead. He sat down, shaking, his rifle empty. The stars above looked cold and indifferent. He thought of home, of his mother's face, of Tomas's laughter. He whispered to the dark, "Why are we still fighting?" The dark did not answer. Elsewhere, far from the front, in a gilded room of marble and gold, King Alaric stared at a map spread across a long table. Pins marked the front lines. His generals argued in circles: move east, move west, hold the ridge, retreat. The king slammed his fist down. "Enough. My son's blood will not be forgotten. We push until the Republic breaks." Silence fell. Outside, snow drifted against the palace windows. Side decisions were made that would cost 100,000 more lives. Across the sea, President Drax faced his own map. "They think we are weakening," he said. "They think we will break. But they are wrong. Republic was born from fire. We will live in fire if we must." His ministers nodded, their faces pale. None dared tell him the truth. The people were starving, the soldiers exhausted, the factories crumbling. The war had already consumed the Republic, but pride refused to surrender. Months blurred into one another. Battles were fought over the same hills, the same rivers, again and again. Each side lost men they could not replace. Each victory tasted like defeat. The soldiers joked that they were ghosts already, only waiting for their bodies to realize it. Then came the turning. Battle not of maps and strategies, but of sheer will. The city of Verdun, once the jewel of the continent, stood between the two armies like a dying flame. Whoever held it would hold the war itself. Both kings knew it. Both sent everything they had. The bombardment lasted 7 days. By the 8th, the city was gone. Streets were rivers of rubble, buildings hollowed shells, civilians hid in basements that became tombs. The sky was never dark. It burned day and night with the light of destruction. Elias and his unit were ordered to enter the ruins, to clear what was left. "There's nothing left to clear," one soldier muttered. "Only ghosts." Still, they went. They moved through the shattered city like shadows. Windows stared like empty eyes. Every step crunched on glass, on bone. In one house, Elias found a child's toy half buried in dust, a wooden horse, its head cracked. He held it for a moment, then set it down gently. "Who will rebuild this?" he whispered. No one answered. As night fell, the enemy counterattacked. Street by street, house by house, men fought hand to hand. Rifles gave way to knives, two fists, two desperation. The air was thick with screams and smoke. Elias found himself cornered in a ruined church. Stained glass above was shattered, the altar broken. Soldier charged him, bayonet raised. Elias fired, missed, swung his rifle like a club. The two fell together, rolling in the dirt. When it was over, only Elias stood. He looked down at the man he had killed and saw not an enemy, just another boy, no older than himself. For the first time, he didn't feel fear or triumph, only emptiness. Outside, the city burned. Commanders on both sides claimed victory, but no one truly won. When dawn came, Verdun was silent. The wind blew ashes through the empty streets. The newspapers called it the turning point. But for the men who fought there, it was simply the day everything broke. Back in Atheron, the king received the news. "Yes, we have taken the city," his general reported. Alaric nodded slowly, and at what cost? The general hesitated. "Shh. Too high to count." The king turned away, and stopped counting. That night he walked alone through the palace gardens. Statues of his ancestors loomed in the moonlight. He spoke softly, as if to ghosts. "I wanted to make the world fear us. Instead, I've taught it how to die." For the first time, he felt the weight of the crown, not its power, but its curse. Across the sea, President Drax stared at the same news. His ministers urged him to negotiate. "We can't win," they pleaded. "Not like this." But Drax's pride was stronger than his reason. "The Republic does not bow," he said coldly. "If we must fall, we'll fall standing." Outside his window, the factories burned for lack of coal. In the ruins of Verdun, Elias and a handful of survivors waited for relief that never came. Days passed. They scavenged food, shared water, buried their dead. The city groaned like a dying beast around them. One night, as snow began to fall, Elias lit a small fire in the shell of a house. The flames flickered weakly against the cold. "Do you think anyone knows we're still here?" one soldier asked. Elias stared into the fire. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. But we know. That's enough." The narrator's voice rose softly over the wind. "Every war has a moment when it ceases to be about nations and becomes about survival." This was that moment, the turning point. The day men stopped fighting for victory and began fighting simply to live another sunrise. Elias looked up at the sky. Snowflakes drifted through the smoke, falling gently on his face. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace, not because the war was over, but because he finally understood it. No one wins. No one ever wins. The fire crackled. The snow kept falling. And far away in rooms of gold and marble, men still planned the next battle. The war was supposed to end quickly. It had lasted 6 long years. No one remembered the reasons anymore. Only the ruins left behind. Maps had become meaningless. Borders erased by blood. The land itself seemed tired of carrying the weight of men's hatred. Elias Corrin had stopped keeping track of where he was. Every place looked the same. Shattered buildings, broken roads, the smell of smoke that never left the air. He had seen friends die and enemies beg for mercy. He had learned that bullets didn't care which side they were on. They simply found flesh and ended stories. Winter came again, harsh and unrelenting. Snow covered the trenches like a shroud, hiding the dead beneath white silence. The soldiers no longer sang, no longer cheered. They moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes too old for their years. The letters stopped coming. The mail no longer reached the front. Even hope, once stubborn, had frozen to death. One evening, as Elias sat near a dying fire, he found an old photograph folded inside his jacket. His mother, his little sister, and the orchard behind their house. The edges were burned, the faces fading. He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it back against his heart. "Just a little longer," he whispered to no one. "Then I'll go home." But home no longer existed. Bombs had reached even the quietest villages. Fields were scorched, rivers poisoned. The world had become one endless battlefield. Back in Atheron, King Alaric looked out from his palace window at a city half in ruins. Factories stood silent. Food was scarce. People whispered of revolt. The king's reflection in the glass looked old, unfamiliar. "This was not the world I meant to build," he said softly. His advisor bowed his head. "Your Majesty, the world builds itself now.
Ow!
We've lost control." Across the sea, President Drax spoke to a weary nation. His once thunderous voice had turned hoarse. "The Republic stands firm," he declared, though the city behind him lay in ashes. "We will never kneel." The crowd cheered weakly, more out of habit than belief. He saw it in their eyes, the exhaustion, the hunger, the quiet question, "When does it end?" He had no answer. The war ground on. Battles blurred into each other, victories too small to matter, losses too vast to count. New weapons appeared, faster, louder, crueler.
Ow.
Men disappeared into the smoke and never returned. The generals still drew lines on maps, but the soldiers stopped caring. The war was no longer about flags or glory. It was survival, and survival had no sides. One night, Elias's unit received new orders to advance across a river swollen with ice and corpses. They obeyed without argument. The air was so cold it burned their lungs. As they crossed, artillery began to fall. The river exploded in columns of fire and water. Men screamed, slipped, vanished beneath the current. Elias reached the far bank alone, crawling onto frozen mud. He looked back. The bridge was gone. His unit was gone. The world was quiet again. He wandered through the ruins for days, living on rainwater and whatever scraps he could find. Once he came across a farmhouse half destroyed by shelling. Inside, a woman and her child huddled by a small fire. He looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. He lowered his rifle and smiled weakly. "I'm not here to fight." The woman didn't answer, but after a moment she handed him a piece of bread. It was the first act of kindness he had seen in months. They shared the silence. When he left, the child waved. For the first time in years, Elias smiled. Meanwhile, in the great halls of power, peace was finally being whispered. Not from mercy, but exhaustion. Both sides had nothing left to give. The armies were broken, the people starving. The kings and presidents had become prisoners of their own pride. They spoke of victory, but their words rang hollow in the echo of so many dead. In Atheron, King Alaric signed the decree for one last offensive. "We must finish this with honor," he told his council, "so that our sons may live free." The old general met his eyes. "Your Majesty, we've already buried our sons." The king turned away. That night, he wandered the halls of his palace alone, his footsteps echoing like a confession. The final battle came without warning. Armies met in a valley choked with fog. It was impossible to tell who fired first. The sky thundered, the earth split, and the last strength of nations poured into the soil. Elias fought through the chaos, deaf to everything but the pounding of his heart. Around him, men fell like rain. When his rifle jammed, he picked up another. When his legs gave out, he crawled. The noise became endless, shapeless. Time lost meaning. Then, in a heartbeat, it was over. The gun stopped. The air hung heavy with silence. Smoke drifted over the valley like a curtain closing on a tragedy. Elias stood, shaking, surrounded by bodies. He could hear nothing but the wind. "Is it done?" He asked no one. The wind didn't answer. The next morning, word spread through the camps. The kings had agreed to peace. The war was over. Men wept, laughed, screamed. Some simply stared, unable to believe it. Elias sat in the mud, his rifle across his knees. He felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just emptiness. The kind that comes when something too big to understand finally ends. Across the world, church bells rang for the first time in years. But their sound was different now. Not triumphant, but hollow. Cities celebrated, but half their streets were rubble. Families reunited, but half their chairs stayed empty. The flags rose high, but the people beneath them bowed their heads. King Alaric walked through his throne room, now quiet and cold. He looked at the banners of victory hanging from the ceiling. "We have one," he said aloud, as if to convince himself. But the word felt like ash in his mouth. He turned to his reflection in the window and whispered, "If this is victory, may God forgive us for seeking it." President Drax gave his final speech in a ruined square, standing before a sea of broken faces. "We are free," he proclaimed. "The Republic has endured," but his voice cracked on the word free. He looked out at the crowd, widows, orphans, soldiers with empty sleeves, and he knew the truth. The Republic had survived, but its soul had not. Elias walked home. It took weeks. Across plains that had once been battlefields, forests where the trees still bled sap from the fires. Villages were gone, replaced by silence. When he finally reached his home, the orchard was nothing but stumps. The house stood, half collapsed, windows broken. He stepped inside. Dust and memories filled the air. His mother was gone. His sister, too. Only an old chair remained, rocking slightly in the wind. He sat down, closed his eyes, and listened to the quiet. It was not peace. It was simply the absence of noise. And yet, in that emptiness, something fragile stirred a thought, a hope that maybe from the ruins something new could grow. The narrator's voice rose softly, almost a whisper. The price of victory is never paid in gold or glory. It is paid in silence in the spaces left behind by those who will never return. And though the world may rebuild, the echoes of their footsteps will never fade. Elias opened his eyes to the pale light of morning. The war was over, but history had only begun to write its consequences. Dawn rose over a world reborn in ruins. The guns had fallen silent, the flags had been folded, and for the first time in years, the air no longer smelled of smoke. Yet the silence felt heavier than the sound of war. It was the quiet of absence of voices lost, cities gone, and hearts too tired to celebrate. Elias Corrin walked through the remains of a world he no longer recognized. The roads were cracked, the towns hollow, the people thin shadows of who they had been. Everywhere he went, the same question lingered in the air. Was it worth it? No one had an answer. Nations began to rebuild, but their hands still shook. New borders were drawn by men who had never seen the front lines. Old empires crumbled, replaced by new governments that promised peace with the same fervor their predecessors had promised glory. The word victory disappeared from the speeches. The word survival took its place. In the capital of Atheron, the once mighty palace stood half empty. King Alaric no longer wore his crown. He had aged beyond his years, his eyes dulled by what he had seen or what he had caused. He walked the halls of his palace like a ghost, stopping before the portraits of his ancestors. "We built an empire," he whispered. "But we forgot to build a world." Days later, he abdicated his throne, vanishing from history as quietly as he had once commanded it. Across the ocean, President Drax addressed his broken nation one final time. "We fought for freedom," he said. "And though we stand free, we must never again forget the cost." His voice trembled. He looked out over the crowd, farmers, widows, children without fathers, and realized his words were not enough. The Republic had survived, but it would never be innocent again. He stepped down from the podium, leaving the flag fluttering alone in the cold wind. The war had changed everything. Science, once meant to heal, had been twisted into the art of destruction. The machines that had killed millions now promised progress. The factories that had built weapons now built dreams, but the smoke was the same. The new world was rising, but beneath its foundations, the ashes of the old still smoldered. Elias found work rebuilding bridges. It was strange to see iron and stone rising again where once there had been fire. His hands, which had learned to hold a rifle, now held tools. Some nights he sat by the river, watching the lights of the rebuilt town flicker in the distance. He rarely spoke. The noise of the world had grown small to him. But inside his silence, something fragile began to grow, something like peace. One afternoon, as he worked near the old train station, he saw a little girl chasing a paper kite through the dust. Her laughter carried across the air, bright and free. For a moment the sound hurt, then he smiled. "Maybe this is how it begins again," he murmured. "Not with kings or armies, just with laughter." Years passed. The world moved on, as it always does. Monuments rose to honor the dead, speeches were made, medals pinned to fading uniforms. The young read about the war in books and could not imagine what it had truly been like. They saw dates, not faces. Numbers, not names. But for those who had lived it, the memories never faded. The sound of distant thunder could still make their hands tremble. The scent of smoke could still bring tears. Elias grew old. The world around him changed faster than he could follow. Airplanes filled the skies. Cities gleamed with electric light. But at night, when he closed his eyes, he still heard the whisper of gunfire, the cries of friends long gone. Sometimes he dreamed of the orchard, of his mother's voice calling him home. In those dreams the world was still green. On his final day, Elias sat beneath a new tree growing in the field where his house once stood. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing across the hills. The wind carried the scent of spring, grass, rain, and something like forgiveness. He smiled faintly, his hands folded in his lap. The world was at peace, imperfect, fragile, but real. It was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the narrator's voice returned, soft, steady, eternal. Wars end, but their echoes never fade. The world changes, yet the scars remain, carved into earth and memory and time itself. Those who lived through the fire carry its light within them, so that others may walk without fear. The war that changed history forever was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of what it means to be human. The wind rose, carrying the final words into the distance. The trees' leaves shivered. The stars appeared, one by one, above a world that had finally learned how fragile peace could be. And in the quiet of that twilight, history exhaled. The guns were gone. The world began again.